What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Big thanks to all of you for listening. If you don't already, please make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Please smash that like button, leave a comment, leave a review, anything you can. Really helps with everything. But the NBA season is about to get into full swing. The Nets are opening in a few days against the Atlanta Hawks. Training camp is just winding down in the preseason, and just had a great talk with Tim Bontemps of ESPN, taking a 10,000-foot view, looking at the Nets organization, kind of evaluating the state of the team, looking at some of what to watch for this season, but more importantly, looking at this rebuild, how the Nets could look to build it out, and what this overall situation, this new direction says about the Nets franchise. And, who better to hear about it than from Tim, who has covered the Nets since their move to Brooklyn in 2012 and been in New York and been around this organization for a long time and now covers the entire NBA as a whole. So really hope you guys enjoy the interview with Tim after the theme music. And I'm joined now by Tim Bontemps, who covers the NBA nationally for ESPN. And Tim, preseason is just about in the rear view. It's 5:20 on Monday. We're getting a flurry of extensions reported. How are you, man?
Doing well. How are you doing, Erik?
I'm doing very well. A big news cycle day for the NBA right now. We got several extensions reported, some of which were somewhat surprising, but I want to talk about some of that, how that could impact the Nets later on. So we'll get more into it as the show goes on. But we're going to be talking about the Nets today, and we're going to be taking a 10,000-foot view, looking at the organization as a whole, some of the main figures. Obviously, everybody knows the Nets are in a tank this season, and they're taking somewhat more of a long-term approach to this. But before we get into the long-term of it all and the state of the organization, just talking about this season, outside of the tank, you're a guy that's been around this organization and the NBA for a long time, but outside of just the tanking aspect of it, what's the most intriguing storyline to you surrounding the Nets team this season?
I mean, I think it's all related to where they finish in the draft, right? I mean, they've got a bunch of guys, whether it's Cam Johnson or Nick Claxton or Dorian Finney-Smith or Dennis Schroeder, whoever, like basically every vet on the team is a potentially interesting trade candidate between now and February. And then the rest of it just comes down to where do they land in the draft? Because like you said, in making the Mikal Bridges trade last summer, getting their draft picks back, it all clearly was pointed towards the next 2 years being in the high part of the lottery in what are two loaded drafts to try to get the kind of game-changing young prospects that the Nets, frankly, haven't had the entire time they've been in Brooklyn. It's kind of a remarkable thing that they haven't had a single lottery pick in the 12 years the team has been in the city. So it's a big chance for them to get into a loaded top of this 25 draft. They'll have another opportunity in 26. They have a ton of cap space next summer. So they can go in a lot of directions when it comes to just trying to accumulate more assets and rebuild. But I mean, that's what the year is going to be about. It's going to be seeing what some of these young guys look like. And it's going to be, Noah Clowney and these other guys. And then it's also going to be about trying to position themselves as best they can for the lottery and where it lands there. And that includes these guys that could potentially change teams between now and February, which is going to be interesting to keep people around the league. So much less about the on-court product than it's been in recent years, other than how many losses they can get, how many ping pong balls they can accumulate as a result.
And we'll talk more about those different directions that the Nets can go. But the guy who's still captaining this is obviously general manager Sean Marks, and a guy who, rebuilt this team once before with far less optimal circumstances than he has now in terms of draft picks and cap space and young talent and all that. But you look at the journey of Sean Marks in this organization, a guy who, as I said, rebuilt the team from a situation that a lot of people considered one of the worst in NBA history from a team building perspective. He, builds it up to a place where Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving sign. Then you get a guy like James Harden coming in, and all of that collapses. And then they're in this transitional period headlined by Mikal Bridges, and that fizzles out, and they're now in another rebuild. So, with you being around the team and following all of this and how this timeline of events has transpired, were you surprised that he made it through this past offseason and was given the green light to kind of start another rebuild after all of that?
And I wouldn't say I was surprised, but I mean, look, it's obviously, the next year is going to be a pretty important year for the franchise on a lot of levels, right? It's going to be, we'll see what happens with the draft next summer. We'll see what happens with these moves this year. But like, this is a pretty critical period to really establish what direction the Nets are going in and how they're going to start this thing off. And, the fact that they've gone this direction with Sean sitting there, you'd certainly think he's going to get a chance to do it. And, I mean, you could argue it's as important a year as the franchise has had the whole time it's been in Brooklyn, because they haven't really ever had the ability to have a long-term plan to build out a team around young players. It's just there's been, in the 12 years they've been in Brooklyn, they've had 4 or 5 or 6 iterations of the team, right? So it's a huge opportunity, I think, for the Nets to really establish the direction that they're going to take for the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years potentially. And it's a really big opportunity, and one that if they capitalize on, it could really set the franchise up in a way it just hasn't been this entire run. Because it's, like I said, it's been, you had the Darren Williams team, and then you had the KG and Garnett team, and then you had the team rebuilding after that, and then you had the KD and Kyrie team, and then you've had sort of the last couple of years have been after that. Like, every couple of years it's just been completely reinvented, and now they have an opportunity to really lay a foundation and have a team, in theory, with a star player that they can draft and home grow and have around for a decade. And it's a really big opportunity for them if they can collect on it and connect on it properly.
When you're looking at Sean Marks and the job that he's done here over the years, obviously, like I said, rebuilt the team once before, has had success in the draft. When you look at the guys that he's found, in the 20s or later, like Jared Allen, Nick Claxton, Karis LeVert, Cam Thomas, those guys, even now Noah Clowney and Jalen Wilson are looking promising. And then some of the bigger scale moves have gone poorly in terms of bringing those stars in, and just the management of the team overall. Some of the head coaching hires like Steve Nash and Jacques Vaughn haven't worked out well. Just when you evaluate the job that Sean's done as a GM so far, do you think that he's the best option, or do you think that he's an option that was best equipped to moving forward? Because obviously they're going into a rebuild. That's something he's done well once before, but it's kind of a situation where a lot of people are surprised that a GM's been able to have this long of a leash, 8, 9 years now, one playoff series win. It's somewhat unprecedented in terms of the length that he's gotten to play this out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say at the end of the day, when you're talking about a guy running a team like this, it all comes down to what one person's opinion is, and that's Joe Tsai, right? And as long as Joe Tsai believes in Sean Marks, it doesn't really matter. And I think if you look at anybody that's had the kind of tenure that Sean has had with the team, they're going to have a record that's got a lot of pluses and a lot of minuses, right? Like, if you're running a team for 10 years, doesn't matter how good or bad the team is, you're going to have a lot of ups and downs. And it's really just a matter of how you look at it. So as long as Joe Tsai continues to believe that Sean Marks is the guy who should be running his team, then John's going to be running the team. And, he's got, again, it goes back to that Mikal Bridges trade truly changed the entire fortunes of the franchise, because the Nets were stuck. They didn't really have any direction to go in. You saw what the team looked like last year. They couldn't really rebuild. They couldn't really go forward. They were just stuck in neutral. And that trade, even though in the short term they have to go backward, now they can go forward. And look, the Knicks desperately want Mikal Bridges. I mean, ironically, the Knicks did them a big favor, and it allowed them to sort of maneuver things around and make everything work. And I like the way they pivoted with Houston to get their picks back. And it gives them just a huge opportunity. So, like I said, whatever the debate is about that, the bottom line is whoever's in charge, and it, certainly doesn't look like it's going to be anybody but Sean going forward, then they've got a huge opportunity right now to really do something this franchise hasn't done. And frankly, I've wanted it to do since I was covering the team when they first got into the city, which is have a guy that they can truly build the team around going forward. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but you look at the Liberty, they get Sabrina Ionescu with the first pick in the draft a couple of years ago, right? And then all of a sudden, other people want to play there. They build a team. Obviously, they just won the title. Like, I'm not saying that if you get Cooper Flagg or Ace Bailey or whoever, that it's immediately going to turn around, but it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. And it is just, I mean, I keep saying it because the next 6 months don't really matter in the long term, right? Other than just how much they lose. But next June's got a chance to really set this franchise up for a long time. And last year when I was at the Commissioner's Cup, happened to just be there watching the game with Kevin Pelton. Didn't think I was going to watch Joe Tsai and company consummate a trade, but they did. And it was a huge swing for these guys. And it took them from being a team that didn't really have a direction and didn't really have anywhere to go to one that for the next couple of years can chart a very clear path and potentially set itself up to have a long sustained run of success where, you look at what the Celtics have done the last 8 or 10 years. Obviously those picks came from the Nets, but you get 2 picks in the top 5 and you hit on them like the Celtics did with Tatum and Brown, like your team's going to be good. Might not win a title, but the team's going to be good and have guys you can celebrate and build around and rally around and build a fan base around. And like, it's just all stuff that the Nets with these transient teams coming in and out have never really been able to do, no matter how talented they were. And so I'm excited to see what that looks like. And hopefully it can lead to a, long-term sustainable, really good team.
When you talk about the way that this Nets franchise was before they made the move to Brooklyn, obviously, Destrian, we remember what those games were like in Newark and at the Meadowlands before that. And, the fans with paper bags over their head. And I think some NBA people before that had described it as basketball Siberia or something along those lines. So they moved to Brooklyn. And as you said, since then, it's all just kind of been this shuffling through of these different iterations of the teams, mostly with guys who have been veterans who, very big names, but made their names in, elsewhere with other teams. So, and, a lot of people I talked about, the Nets come to Brooklyn. Are they going to be able to stake a claim to New York and build a fan base, have a little bit more market share there? Do you think that the way that they've gone about this from Mikhail Prokhorov and now to Joe Tsai in terms of the way that they've tried to build it has kind of been an inhibitor to building, that fan base or staking a claim in New York? Because I feel like a lot of the fans weren't able to have as much of a connection to all these guys because they had made their names with other teams and they were kind of just in and out the door.
I think it's just I don't think it's like a better or worse thing. I just think it's the way this is played out, right? And the truth is, like, the best way to have guys engage, have a fan base engage with a team is to be able to have a young homegrown team that's with guys that you drafted and developed over time, right? Like, it's just naturally a team that's going to be more popular and have a broader fan base than one that is going through a new iteration of the team every couple of years, right? And is still trying to cut into the market share that the Knicks have in the city, which is obviously a massive. So, I think it just is what it is. And ultimately, like, you can go back and see why the Nets did all the stuff they did, and it all made sense in the moment to different degrees, right? Like, I get it, but the ultimate outcome is that there just hasn't been an ability to really sustain a fan base long term. And like I said, you look at the Liberty, like, that's sort of what the hopeful blueprint is here. You get a high pick, you draft a young star, that then allows you to, hopefully for the Nets' sake, they get another high pick next year. They get another really good young player. I mean, look, they're probably not going to end up with Cooper Flagg and AJ Davisana, but they might, or they get one of those guys and another high-level player. So you put all that together, and then going forward, like again, it's ironic because of the picks came from Boston, but you look at having Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. If you get 2 young players like that, you're guaranteeing yourself a long runway of being really good. And it's a team you can invest in and build around and celebrate. And the fact that we're 12 years into the Nets' time in Brooklyn, and the only guy you could maybe think about as jersey being retired eventually is Brook Lopez. And that's in part because he played a long time with the Nets before that.
Yeah, I don't know about that one.
I'm not saying he's going to get his jersey retired. My point is that there's not anybody else, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, that just sort of underscores that there haven't been any guys that the fan base can really rally around. Be like, this is our guy. There's no Devin Booker. There's no, like, even Karl Towns, right? Karl Towns just got traded away from the Wolves, but, like, spent 9 or 10 years there, got to the conference finals, got to the playoffs a couple of times, has a bunch of high leverage places in the history of the franchise, right? Like, they don't even have a guy with that kind of history with the team. Like I was thinking about it earlier. If you just go, I meant to look it up before we started, but if you go look over the last few years, I'm going to try to pull it up now while we're talking, but like there's only, the team that like the player with the most games played since the team came to Brooklyn might still be Brook Lopez, and he played on the team for like 4 years. So, it's just there's just not a lot of there's just not a lot of history to choose from and to celebrate. And so hopefully for them over time, if they can hit these draft picks and sort of reset this young player thing in a different direction. Yeah. So the only guy who's played 400 games since the start of the 2012 season is Joe Harris. And the top 5 guys are Joe Harris, Spencer Dinwiddie, Brook Lopez, Joe Johnson, and Nick Claxton.
There you go.
And the next 5 are Jared Allen, Rondae Hollis Jefferson, Karis LeVert, Bojan Bogdanovic, and Darren Williams, who played in 210 games. There's 10 players in 12 years with the Nets in Brooklyn who have played at least 200 games with the team. It's not even 3 full seasons. Like that just sums up how little history is tied in with the team. That's what they have a chance to finally change. And I think if you're a Nets fan, I think that's exciting. And I think for the Nets organization, I think it's really exciting. And it's just, to me, it's a dramatically different feeling than the one this time a year ago. When, they had Mikal Bridges, they had some talent, but you looked at the team and you just kept saying, what is the direction? Where are they going to go? How is this going to change? Or are they just going to be spinning their wheels for 5 years and they can't really go anywhere? And now everything looks different. And there's a lot of optimism. So, it's hard to be optimistic when you're staring at a team that's going to be really bad and lose a ton of games in the short term if you're a Nets fan. But I think in the medium term, and especially in the long term, this season's got a chance to be the best thing to happen to the franchise in a long time. And I'm very curious to see how it goes.
And when we talk about those guys who can be that homegrown talent that, the fan base can really rally around for the next decade or so or whatever, like Sean Marks made it clear that the talent in the 2025 and 2026 draft classes obviously played a strong role in his decision to pivot to this rebuild and get his picks back and bottom out. But, I don't want to get too deep into the draft class and all that because we're going to have so much time.
Exactly.
We're going to have so much time to do that as Nets fans. But, just big picture wise, like what have you have people at ESPN like Cavoni and other people whose job is just to evaluate the draft year round. So just like broad perspective, like what do you hear about the strength of this class, not just in those top guys, because the Nets are going to have 4 first-round picks in this class. Like people are kind of making it out like this can be a generational, class in terms of the guys at the top and then a lot of talent throughout. Just what have you heard, like broad strokes?
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan's covered the draft for 20 years, says it's probably the deepest one he's ever covered. And there's guys down in the teens and 20s and 30s who could be good. Like it's a good year to have a lot of picks. And, like we'll see if the Nets make all the picks and they move some stuff around, move some picks to future years, whatever. But like this is a team that desperately needs an infusion of young talent. And this draft's going to give them an opportunity to get 2 or 3 or 4 guys in the door who are really talented. And like you look at Oklahoma City, you look at all these, look at a lot of these teams, like you just got to take as many swings as you can and get as many players as you can. And if you do that and you do your job scouting and developing, you're going to have a chance to hit on a few of them and you got a really good team in the future. So like, yeah, I mean, again, this was the time to make this move for this year and next year. And like, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And I think in this case, there was a perfect storm of events that led to the Nets getting to be in a great spot for what they were trying to do. And it gave them a chance to hit the reset button at the best time possible. And now they've got to land the plane, to use a Doc Rivers term, and get through the season, execute in the draft, execute in free agency next summer in terms of using their space and a variety of ways to improve. But it is just a much different and more optimistic situation than there's been around the team in a while. And it does give them a real path to long-term stability and sustainability that, frankly, I didn't think they were going to have a way to get to. And so, it landed really well for them, and it's got a chance to work out really nicely.
And obviously the way that they got there was getting those picks back from Houston and also making the trade, sending Mikal Bridges to the New York Knicks. And so many different people, myself and you, have talked about that Bridges trade and, who won it and all those things along those lines. But just having you on here and a guy who's been around New York, been around this Knicks organization, been around the Knicks, I'm just curious. I don't think people were so surprised that the Nets made the move to pivot to rebuild, but the way they did it and sending into the Knicks, I'm just curious, how surprised were you that those two teams were able to, come to terms on a deal of that magnitude? Is that something that, you've been covering the Nets since they came to Brooklyn and have been around both teams? That's something that you ever saw coming?
The Nets hadn't made a draft trade with the Knicks since before I was born. I'm almost 40.
1983, so, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, it was definitely surprising. It was surprising the trade happened. It was surprising it happened how it did. But like you said, ultimately, I can understand, I would maybe say the Knicks overpaid a little bit for the way they made the moves this summer, but I can understand what the Knicks are trying to do. Like we've talked about in the Hoop Collective pod a bunch. And again, it worked out great for the Nets. It was the right time to do it. That their team was not going anywhere. They were not going anywhere with Mikal Bridges. He's a really nice player. It just wasn't, he wasn't the guy that was going to lead them to being a contending team, especially when he still had a lot of value with his contract being lower the next couple of years. So now he gets on a team that's got a chance to get 10, and the Nets now put themselves again in a position where they can really dictate the future of their franchise and get a young star player to build around for the long term. It really couldn't have worked out better. Definitely wasn't expecting it to happen when it did. Definitely wasn't expecting the deal to happen that did. But I mean, it's a home run deal for them, I think, for the Nets. And like I said, I just keep saying it, but it really has a chance to be one of the most important moments in the history of the franchise if the next couple of years goes well, because it just gave them a totally new lease on life that they otherwise didn't have a chance to have.
And the guy who's going to be leading at least the team from the encore perspective into that new phase is Jordi Fernandez, who's a first-time head coach. The Nets hired him. Obviously, we're also looking at Mike Budenholzer and Kevin Young, but they ultimately go with the young first-time head coach who had really been a hot name among the assistants ranks. And Fernandez is somewhat given off a stern disciplinarian vibe during training camp. He called out several players by name for poor efforts after that preseason game in Philly. Several players have said that this is among the hardest training camps that they've ever gone through. Dennis Schroeder today, when asked about Jordy, said, European coaches are always kind of crazy and that he likes it. But, just like, what was your perception of Fernandez before he got the Nets job? And what are you expecting from him, in terms of a personality manager and also a stylistic coach?
Did you say, what did I know him before he came?
Yeah, it's like, what was your perception? I know he was a hot name, but like, what did you know about him? What was your perception of him before he got the job? What are your expectations from him?
Yeah, I personally had not met Jordy before he got the Nets job, but I know a lot of people who've known him for a long time. They've all raved about him. He's known as a great guy, great communicator, really good developmental coach. Like you said, he's a guy who's been talked about for getting a job for several years. He worked for Mike Brown for a long time, worked for Michael Malone, like one of the best assistant coaches in the league for years. And so I'm excited for him to get an opportunity to coach this team. And he's exactly the kind of guy that, makes sense for where the Nets are in their rebuild. Like the fact that they're starting it, right? He did a nice job the last couple of years coaching Team Canada, led them to their first medal in a major international tournament in a long time in the FIBA World Cup, beating the U.S. to get third. So he's got some head coaching experience from that, and he's got a ton of energy, and he's going to dive in and work with this team. And yeah, I mean, it goes back to the beginning. This year's about Noah Clowney and Jalen Wilson and these young players, and like how they develop and how they play and what they look like. And that's what the year is going to be about. And so, yeah, like they should be practicing hard. They should be playing hard. Like this is all about building a foundation of how you want to play and establishing a culture for how you're going to go about your job and what you're going to do on a daily basis and how you want to do it, and how you want to play and what style you want to play, all that kind of stuff. And, I think it's a great opportunity for Jordy. And I thought when the Nets were making their decision, I thought he made a lot of sense to get the job. And he's also a guy that is an affable guy in terms of his public persona. And I think he's going to be able to, do a good job of dealing with the ups and downs, and a lot of downs are going to come with the way the season's going to go. And I'm excited for him to get a shot. I always think it's good. Obviously there's plenty of coaches who get more opportunities and do well, but I always think it's good when you see a guy like him who has grinded for a long time, worked in the G League, was worked as a PD coach, worked his way up to, a guy like that to get an opportunity. I think it's great. And I'm excited to see what he can do with it.
And, you say the season outside of the tank, like we know it's going to be about the development of the young guys. And I think a lot of the young guys, just got here or, have new contracts and are, have a little bit of a leash to see what they can be now. But a guy that is a young guy who has shown promise, but has so many question marks surrounding him is Cam Thomas, who is, at least perceived to be the Nets' lead offensive option this year, and a guy who potentially could take a leap this year after cracking the rotation last season. But a guy who's also entering the final year of his rookie contract. We talked about at the top all the extensions that are happening right now. The Nets are not expected to reach a rookie scale extension with Cam Thomas, and really just a polarizing player around the league, something I've talked about it, ad nauseum throughout this preseason. But, I'm just curious. I want to talk a little bit about extension, what that could potentially look like, but just your perception of Cam Thomas. You talk to so many people around the league. Why do you think he's so polarizing? And do you think he's a player that this year maybe front offices, do you think this year will lead to a lot more clarity about what he's going to be long-term?
I'm not sure. He's one of the more interesting guys in the league in terms of figuring out what his value is. He obviously has shown he can really fill it up. He's got to show he can do more than that. And I don't know if this year is going to help with that because of the way the Nets are built. They don't have a lot of other guys who can get their own shot, and he's going to probably be asked to get his own shot a lot. So, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out and what it looks like because, we've seen a lot of guys in sort of that, smaller shooting guard, combo guard kind of range get paid a lot of money, and those deals have sort of been all over the map. Saw Jalen Green get a bunch of money earlier today. So I'm sure Cam is going to go into the season thinking I should get a ton of money. And, it will be interesting to see if either the Nets or somebody else values him in a way where he's going to get that kind of money, or they're going to say, you got to show us you could do more than score. So he is going to be a very interesting player to watch, and I'm going to be very curious to see what it looks like over the next few months. But certainly, the way the Nets are structured, he's going to get every opportunity to do quite a bit with the ball in his hands because there's not a lot of other options to do so.
When you look at his player archetype, like you just talked about the guys that have gotten paid, but in Cam in particular, he's somewhat undersized for not a point guard. He's 6'3". He's obviously can score really well, but undersized guy who I don't think anybody has any illusions about being a very good defender. Shot a lot better off the ball last season, but just how do you think that player archetype, because I just think he's an interesting guy because he's not a guy that's going to be a number one scorer on a really high level playoff team. So given that, where does that player archetype and where does that, amongst the contender, what's the ideal projection of what he can be? Where does that fit in?
I think that's what this year is about. He's obviously I think if you're looking at as of now, I think the role that makes sense for him is to be a guy who comes in off the bench and lights it up. That's probably the role that he should fill. But coming off last year, I'm sure he thinks he should be getting somewhere near a max deal and should be getting the ball in his hands all the time, being a starter in the NBA. So, this is a big opportunity for him, I think, this year. If he goes out and plays really well and shows people he's more than just a scorer, he's a young guy who's got a lot of athletic talent and can do a lot of things, but I think he's got to go out there and show it. And, it's going to be a very interesting season for him to see where all that lands and what his ultimate market value is as a result.
Well, you talk about some of those guys. I just wrote an article about this, and your colleague Bobby Marks wrote a rookie extensions piece and gave some projections of what he would offer and stuff. And he threw out Anthony Simons' deal, which was 4 years, $100 million, which he said now is the equivalent of 4 years, $125 million with new cap. And I wrote an article. I was just looking at some of those guys who have been extended recently, whether it's an Anthony Simons or, Emmanuel Quickly, Tyler Hero, Jordan Poole, those kinds of guys who have all gotten really big paydays. Jalen Green, another guy who just got $105 million over 3 years, so $35 million annually. it just seems like a lot of those deals, like those are the deals that Cam Thomas's representation is probably going to be pointing to of like, this is what we want. But it seems like there's a question about where he ranks amongst that class of player. And I think when you look at those deals, those aren't really deals that seem like they're going to age great. So I know like the salary cap is going up right now, and these contracts are going to be perceived a lot differently because the percentage of the cap is just going to be much lower. So that's kind of like the going rate for high level role players, it seems now. But when you look at the idea next offseason, if you're an NBA executive, of giving Cam Thomas a 4-year deal approaching $120 million, just what's your reaction or what's your stomach for something like that? Because it seems like it's just all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I like I said before, I think that's exactly the kind of guys that Cam Thomas would be pointing to, saying, pay me what those guys are making or more. And those contracts have all, there's a lot of mixed opinion on those deals across the league, just like there's a lot of mixed opinion on Cam Thomas. Like it's going to make for an interesting season ahead because, that sort of undersized combo scoring guard, there's just a very wide range of opinion on that archetype of player. And with the new rules and the aprons being involved in things and teams being bumping up against them because of the cap not changing for a few years and salaries going up, it's made for a really interesting situation. And like you said, I have not been anticipating Cam getting an extension. I don't think he'll be getting one done here today. And then we'll see what happens next summer when there's not a lot of cap space available, and we'll see where it ultimately lands. But certainly it's going to be probably one of the most interesting things to watch with this Nets team is, can he make strides in other parts of his game, and does that translate him to getting the kind of payday that he was looking for?
And you talk about, the cap space landscape next offseason, something that's very relevant to the Nets because the Nets are expected to lead the league in cap space next summer. The only team with over $30 million in space, like the Wizards are a close second, and some other teams can open space. But that's another asset for Sean Marks in terms of team building. And there's several routes that they can go with that. They can go the restricted free agent route with offer sheets, something that we've seen Sean Marks do before, obviously, upon taking over the team. There could be some UFAs available. They always have the option of taking on salary dumps for late draft picks. It's tough to tell. It's early right now, but just, what's a route that you could see them going with that space? Do you think it's something that they could use to target young players? Because there are guys who are going to be high-level young guys who have not been extended right now, and potentially there could be an opportunity to throw an offer sheet at some of those young guys next summer.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see where that lands. But yeah, the Nets, I think the Nets, by having a lot of cap space next summer, the important thing to remember is they can do a lot of different things, right? You could get teams out of salary cap jail when teams are trying to save money and get away from these aprons. You can use it to sign RFAs. You could use it to, do a variety of things, take on more, get more talent in the door by also taking on money, get draft picks in the future, just collect more draft picks by taking on salary. Like, they have a lot of options to do stuff, and I'm sure they'll do a variety of different things with it. But that's the biggest thing, is it gives them real optionality across the board, including potentially taking on future money to send guys out this year to get better draft capital back in trades, right? So they can go in a lot of different directions. And as they approach the trade deadline, and as the season starts to play out and teams start to try to make moves in what's a pretty wide open league, the Nets are going to have an ability to, really exact a price if they use that cap space well to make other people better, and to get themselves draft picks back as a result.
And when you talk about getting more draft picks, there's something that you touched on the top, and a lot of Nets fans have talked about since the Mikal Bridges trade, is those veteran guys that could be on the trade block this season. I think there's 3 that really stand out for the Nets as possibilities are Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Dennis Schroeder. I'd say Johnson and Finney-Smith probably the most likely. Just, it seems like as the season goes on and the trade conversations start to heat up, that those are guys who are going to be in the forefront of all the speculation. Do you have any sense of what you feel the market value could be like for those guys?
I mean, it's hard to say right now what that's going to look like, right? I mean, a lot of that stuff depends on what the trade market overall looks like, what other players are available, how many teams are aggressively going after stuff. Like, it's one thing to say today, hey, I think this guy is worth X, Y, or Z, but let's see how these guys look during the season. Let's see what teams need. Let's see who else is making trades. Let's see what those teams have available to make in trade. So, certainly the Nets would be looking for future draft capital for all those guys. But I think how they all play and how the year plays out across the league, I think will determine exactly what their overall value is in the market and what the Nets can ultimately get for each of them.
Yeah, well, do you think you're looking at a guy like Cam Johnson? He signed a contract where he's making, I think, $23.5 million this year, and then it's descending. And I think a lot of people thought that was, pretty rich for him, or it's not. It didn't age poor. It aged kind of poorly last season in some people's eyes because he was injured and didn't have a great year. But now you're looking at some of these younger guys, but guys who aren't stars and are going to be viewed as high-end level role players are going to be making 30 and above $30 million a year for some of those guys. Do you think Cam's a guy who's under contract for 2 more years after this? Do you think that contract's viewed a little bit more favorably and could potentially not net the Nets a ton of value because he's not a significant needle mover, I'd say, in a playoff rotation, but a guy who maybe front offices could be looking at that contract if he has, let's say if he has a good start to the year this year and say, that doesn't look too bad, and maybe talk themselves into that a little bit more.
Yeah, again, I really think it comes down to, is Cam healthy and playing well, and what do teams need? I think it's hard to really extrapolate out what that kind of stuff looks like right now because a lot of teams are up against it money-wise, and it's just unclear what the trade market's going to look like as the season plays out. We're sort of in new uncharted waters with the second apron stuff and these restrictions on whether teams could take in more money in trades and whether they can go over the first apron or not, or whether they can go into the second apron or beyond it. And it's just, I think we're going to it sounds like a cop-out answer, but I really just do think that a lot of this year is going to be about teams figuring out where exactly they sit and where they sit within the construct of the new rules to figure out what they have the flexibility to do. And until we see how that manifests itself and what things look like, I think it's very hard to say specifically how things are going to go, other than it obviously makes sense for the Nets to move on from the veteran players. And if they can get fair value for them or good value for them in the market, it's hard to see why any of them would be on the team past February 7th or whatever the date is, because they need more future draft capital and they've got players that can help playoff teams. And if they can make a match there, then I think it makes sense for everybody.
This is a little bit more of a big picture question, but I've been looking at it as just an exercise over the offseason, trying to see what are potential teams that could be in the market for Cam and Dorian and trying to find trades for them. And the new CBA obviously affects a lot of that and has affected a lot of the ways that teams have been able to pull off trades, and it's made things a lot more difficult for a lot of teams. So I'm just curious, in a league that I feel like has always embraced player movement and it's been a big part of the product and just the drama of the league and all that, do you think that the CBA has had the desired effect? Because I think it's kind of strange how it seems like a lot of these deals are becoming more difficult, and you're seeing like the Knicks and Wolves trade just now, these loopholes and these different machinations and all these hoops that these teams are having to jump through to pull that off. Just, do you think it's had the desired effect, and do you think that it's going to limit the number of deals that we'll see moving forward?
The NBA wanted to keep high-spending teams from being able to spend whatever they want. So it's worked in that sense. And I think there are a lot of tools in there that teams can use to have more flexibility in building out their rosters, but it's going to require the cap to go up, the aprons to go up, to have the ability to really utilize it, because we've been stuck in this period the last couple of years where salaries kept going up, the cap stayed flat because of the pandemic. And because of that, the salaries just grew so much that everybody kind of got jammed up against everything. And I think if we extrapolate out 3 years from now, I think everybody's books will look different. And I think people will be farther away from the aprons. And I think that there'll be more flexibility to make moves. And I think things overall will probably look different. But right now, everybody's sort of caught between the last era and the new one. And it's just going to take a little while for that to sort itself out. So I do think in the short term, some of those things have hindered the trade market. Like, for example, the fact that teams are hard capped at the first apron. If they take in more money than they send out in a deal, that has caused a lot of various machinations to have to take place for teams to jump through hoops to make stuff work. Or if it just all was at the second apron, then you probably wouldn't have as hard of a time seeing some of these guys get moved. Like the Knicks trade got a lot more complicated because both the Wolves and the Knicks couldn't take in more money than they sent out. So they had to sort of maneuver things around a little bit to make that happen. So yeah, it's a very interesting situation, but ultimately, I think when you look at it from a macro standpoint, it's a deal that we have to wait 3 years. And if we're having the same conversation in the fall of 27 about where the league sits, which by the way, we could even have expansion by then, who knows? Like there's just so many things that are going to probably happen over the next 5 years that it's very hard to look that far ahead and say, here's how things exactly are going to look. And if the last few CBAs are any indication, every time one of these deals gets done, this is the third or fourth one I've covered now, it seems like problems have been addressed at the beginning of it. And by the time the CBA is done, you come up with a few more that have been created either by it or stuff that has manifested as a result of what you did in the last one. And I'm sure that's going to be the case over the next 4 or 5 years until the new one is done. And it's just going to be a matter of waiting to see what it all looks like first.
And we got into that by talking about the veterans that could potentially be on the block for the Nets. And one veteran that I didn't mention, because I don't really think that there's a possibility of him being traded, is Ben Simmons. And we're, getting into now the third year of the Ben Simmons experience with the Nets. And I've stood firm on trying not to talk about it too much because it's a guy that really, obviously, like we talked about this year, not really mattering outside of the development of young players from the on-court standpoint. Yet Ben Simmons is still in this organization. He's still expected to start. And just from an NBA storyline perspective, a really interesting story just from the sense of a guy who came in, people thought had the potential to be one of the best players of all time, at least from his skill set, and has really had a fall from grace, obviously. When you look at this whole Ben Simmons experience, are you surprised that he's still on this Nets roster right now? Or just like, what do you think that the Nets are looking to gain, or what do you think that his future could have in store with the way this year plays out for him? Because he's kind of like a fish out of water on this team, in certain circumstances.
I'm not surprised he's still here because it didn't like make sense for the Nets to incentivize some team to take him, right? And we just talked about how a lot of teams can't really take on money. Well, obviously Ben Simmons makes a lot of money, so it's hard to include him in a deal for any value right now. So, I mean, look, I think this year is a big opportunity for him. If he can stay on the court and play effectively and well, then I think it's going to give him an opportunity to set himself up to get another deal next summer and be in the league and be an effective player. Because he's always been a guy who can do a lot of different things on the court, even though he doesn't obviously provide much of a value as a perimeter shooter. But if he can't stay healthy and it's a year sort of like last year again, then it's hard to know what his future is going to look like. And obviously, like you said, like the injuries have totally derailed his career. And obviously things look a lot different than when he signed this max contract a few years ago. But at the end of the day, the Nets have every reason to roll him out there and see if he can regain any of that and help them on a nightly basis. And if he's able to, then whether it's as a buyout candidate in the spring, if he doesn't get traded, whether he's used as salary balance in a trade where a team might say, hey, we can get something out of him for the next couple of months and then also get off a long-term deal and get his bird rights for the future. Like whatever the scenario, if, Ben's got a chance to reestablish his value this year by playing well. And he's like a lot of these other guys that these other guys that we've talked about that this year, whether it's Cam Johnson or Dorian Finney-Smith or whatever, these veteran players, it's about them, because all those guys are, Cam's not expiring, but for Dorian, who I believe is, and Dennis Schroeder who is, and Ben who is, it's an opportunity for them to all establish a mark for themselves going forward. And if they play well, then they're either going to be traded somewhere and have a chance to have a big role in the playoffs or put themselves in a spot where they can get paid next summer. So even if it's not necessarily about wins on the court, there's a lot of ways this year can be wins for a lot of the people involved. And for Ben Simmons, to me, it's just about being able to be on the court and be healthy and play a bunch of games. If you can, then that'll be good.
If you're a Nets fan and you're looking at the younger players on this team, who's the player that you feel you'd have the most excitement about being, a long-term piece who could develop into, a high-level rotation player down the line?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second, Erik.
Said if you're a Nets fan, who's the young player on this team that you would have the most excitement or encouragement about becoming a high-level rotation piece for this team down the line?
I mean, it's obviously a little early to say with some of them, but I think both Jalen Wilson and Noah Clowney both have opportunities to do that. Those are young, interesting guys who can do, Jalen Wilson, everybody's looking for wing players who can do stuff. He's shown some real flashes. Obviously you get a guy in the second round who's got a chance to play at all. That's a big win. And Noah Clowney's a super young, athletic big who can do a lot of stuff. So, I think both of those guys are interesting. And, but again, that's what this year's about. It's just about letting those guys grow and play, see what they can do, let them explore the studio space, try different stuff. Because, 2-3 years from now, maybe they're both guys that are on good long-term deals and are pieces that can really fit for them going forward. So, but yeah, I think those are the two guys in particular on this roster where I'd look at it and say, I think there's some intriguing upside. It's just a matter of whether they hit on it.
Last thing before I let you go, you're a guy that's been around the Nets for a long time, covered them through the move to Brooklyn, and been really plugged into everything that's gone on. A lot of my listeners, I think, go far back and probably remember the work that you were doing. Do you have one story about something that went on behind the scenes with the team, whether in New Jersey and missed the move to Brooklyn, or following that, one story that you thought was really interesting or that you've told, about this Nets organization in particular?
I mean, there's been a lot of them over time. I mean, the one that I just sort of remember is being in the arena on draft night 2013 and watching everybody walk out after they made that trade. Mark Spears patting me on the shoulder and saying you should write a book, which I didn't do. But yeah, it's been a crazy 12 years and a ton of things have happened, and it's been a fascinating run there. And, again, that's why I am really excited for what they've got going forward now, because after all these iterations of this team, all these different things that have happened, I know I've just repeated it a bunch, but it really is the deal with this team. They're sort of a blank canvas. And, when they were doing this the first time a few years ago with Kenny Atkinson, obviously they did a great job developing guys like Joe Harris and drafting Jared Allen and Karis LeVert later, reviving Spencer Dinwiddie's career. All that stuff was great, but they didn't have the guy that you could really say, yeah, this is a guy we can really invest in for the next decade. Next June, they have a chance to do that. That's just going to be a totally different experience for this franchise and for this fan base. And so, yeah, I mean, between the Jason Kidd stuff going to Milwaukee, obviously I broke that story way back in the day, between the trade itself when it happened, Hurricane Sandy delaying the start of the team playing its first season, the crazy series with the Bulls, the crazy series with the Raptors, the crazy series with the Bucks. There's just a ton of stuff that's happened with this team over the past 12 years. And it doesn't look like it's going to be any less boring or any more boring anytime soon. It's going to be, I just hope that the fan base really gets something to invest itself in for a long time, because I know there's a lot of fans who've been waiting for something to really sink their teeth into, and hopefully the way this is played out gives them an opportunity to do that.
Well said. I think a lot of fans would agree with that assessment and agree with what to look forward to this season. Tim, really appreciate you coming on. Obviously have done just amazing work covering the NBA for a really long time, and look forward to hearing your analysis about the Nets if and when they creep a little bit back towards relevance, and maybe we'll talk more about it then.
Yeah, sounds good, man. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with Tim, really insightful, and a guy who has been plugged into the Nets for a long time and now just covering on a national scale the league as a whole. As I said at the top, if you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA, comment, like, anything you guys can do to help drive up engagement. Much appreciated. But the Nets are getting back into it. We have meaningful basketball coming up in a few days. I'll have coverage of all that and everything related to it throughout the season here on Believe in Nets. I'll talk to you guys soon.